The lonely rancher lived far from towns, far from noise, and far from people who asked questions he did not want to answer. His small wooden house stood alone on open land where the wind spoke more than humans ever did, and every morning he woke before the sun because sleep never stayed with him for long. He was a man shaped by silence, and silence had become his only companion. Years ago, he had chosen this life on purpose, believing distance could erase memory, believing hard work could quiet the past. His days followed the same pattern: feed the animals, check the fences, ride across the dry land, and return home before night swallowed the sky. He spoke to no one, and no one came looking for him. In town, people knew him only as a quiet man who kept to himself, a man who paid in cash and left without conversation. What they did not know was that silence was not peace for him. It was punishment he gave himself. The land around him was wide and empty, yet it felt heavy, as if it carried stories buried deep in the soil. Sometimes, when the sun sank low and painted the ground red, the rancher felt watched, not by eyes, but by memories he could not escape. He had seen things in his younger days, things that could not be undone, and even though his hands were clean, his conscience was not. He told himself that he was only one man, that he had no power back then, but the excuses felt weaker with every passing year. At night, when the wind rattled the windows, he remembered voices raised in anger, promises broken, and moments when he chose to look away instead of speaking out. The rancher believed that living alone was a fair trade for his silence, that loneliness was the price he deserved to pay. He did not drink, he did not laugh, and he did not dream of a better future. He simply survived, one quiet day at a time. The animals trusted him more than people ever did, and in their simple needs, he found a kind of comfort. They did not judge him, did not ask about the past, and did not remind him of who he used to be. Still, there were moments when the loneliness pressed too hard on his chest, moments when he wondered if the land itself remembered more than he wished it did. On some mornings, the air felt different, thick and uneasy, as if something unseen was waiting to be found. He would shake off the feeling and tell himself it was nothing, just the weight of another empty day. But deep inside, he knew his quiet life was built on fragile ground. The rancher sensed that the past had not finished with him yet, that silence could only hide truth for so long. As the sun rose higher on that particular morning, he saddled his horse like always, unaware that routine was about to fail him. The land looked the same as it always did, wide and calm, but there was a strange stillness that made even the birds quiet. He did not know it yet, but the peace he clung to was already breaking, and the silence he trusted was about to speak louder than ever before. The rancher had ridden this land 1,000 times before, yet that morning felt different from the first step his horse took. The air was heavy, quiet in a way that pressed against his ears, and even the wind seemed afraid to move. He told himself it was nothing, just another long day under the open sky, but his heart beat faster for reasons he could not explain. As he guided his horse toward a cluster of old trees near the edge of his land, an uneasy feeling crawled up his spine. The place had always been avoided, not because of danger, but because it felt wrong, like the land itself carried a wound. When he drew closer, his horse slowed, sensing what the rancher had not yet fully understood. Then he saw something that made his breath stop and his hands grow cold. At first, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing, searching for another explanation, another shape, another lie to hold on to. But the truth stood there, unmoving, waiting for him. A young Apache girl was there, and beside her, a sign that spoke louder than any scream ever could. The rancher did not move for a long moment. Time seemed to stretch, pulling him into a silence deeper than any he had ever known. His chest tightened as guilt and fear rushed through him together, mixing until he could no longer tell them apart. He felt like an intruder in a moment that was not meant to be witnessed, like history had chosen him as its unwilling audience. The words on the sign burned into his memory, not because of their message alone, but because of what they represented: anger left unresolved, pain passed down, and a past that had never truly ended. The rancher dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady, his mind racing back through years he had tried to bury. He did not touch anything, he could not. All he could do was stand there, listening to the pounding of his own heart and the questions screaming inside his head. Who had done this, and why here on his land? Why now, after so many years of quiet? The girl's presence felt like an accusation, even though she said nothing. In her stillness, he saw every time he had stayed silent, every moment he had chosen safety over truth. The rancher felt smaller than he ever had before, reduced from a man who believed he understood loneliness to someone who realized he had never truly understood suffering. He remembered faces from the past, voices from a time when fear ruled decisions and cruelty was often disguised as survival. Back then, he had told himself that one voice could not change anything, that speaking up would only bring trouble. Standing there now, he saw how wrong he had been. Silence had not erased harm, it had allowed it to grow roots. The land around him felt different, no longer just soil and grass, but a witness that had been waiting patiently for someone to finally look. The rancher's eyes filled with tears he did not wipe away, because he no longer felt he had the right to hide his pain. This discovery was not just a tragedy, it was a message sent across time, a reminder that the past never stays buried forever. He felt fear, yes, but also a strange pull toward responsibility, as if the land itself was asking him a question he could no longer ignore. He knew that once he turned away from this place, his life would never return to the quiet routine he once depended on. The lonely rancher had spent years running from memory, but now memory stood in front of him, demanding to be seen. As he finally stepped back and mounted his horse, his hands shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he now carried. He rode away slowly, knowing that the discovery he had made was only the beginning, and that silence, the thing he trusted most, had finally betrayed him. The sign was what stayed with the rancher long after he turned his horse away from the trees. It was not large, and it was not carefully made, yet it carried a weight heavier than anything he had ever known. The words carved into it did not shout, but they accused, and they followed him like a shadow across the land. As he rode back toward his house, those words repeated in his mind again and again, refusing to fade. He had seen signs before, markers for land, warnings for danger, names carved by men who wanted to be remembered, but this one felt different. This sign was not meant to guide or protect. It was meant to remind. It carried anger that had waited too long to speak and pain that had never been healed. The rancher tried to tell himself it was only wood and words, yet his heart knew better. That sign had been written for someone like him, someone who lived safely while others suffered quietly. Every step his horse took seemed to echo the message deeper into his chest. When he reached his house, the familiar walls offered no comfort. The small room felt tighter than usual, as if the past had followed him inside. He sat on a wooden chair and stared at the floor, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear alone but from understanding. The sign had opened a door he had kept locked for years. It forced him to remember moments he had tried to bury, times when he heard injustice spoken openly and chose not to answer, times when silence felt easier than truth. He remembered standing among other men long ago, watching wrong things happen, telling himself it was not his place to interfere. Back then, he believed survival meant staying quiet. Now, the words on that sign stripped away every excuse he had ever made. They asked him a simple question he could no longer avoid: how much harm is silence responsible for? The rancher stood and walked to the window, looking out at the wide land that once felt like freedom. Now it felt like a witness, stretching endlessly, remembering everything. He wondered how many stories were hidden beneath the dust, how many voices were never heard. The sign had turned the land into a mirror, and he did not like the reflection staring back at him. He felt anger rise inside him, not only toward whoever had left that message, but toward himself. He had believed that living alone was a form of punishment, that loneliness balanced the wrongs of the past. But the sign made it clear that isolation was not justice. It was escape. The rancher realized that the words were not demanding revenge. They were demanding recognition. They were proof that pain does not disappear when ignored, that history does not forgive silence simply because time has passed. As night fell, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the wind outside as if it carried whispers from long ago. Every sound reminded him of the sign hanging quietly in the trees, waiting to be seen. He understood now that this was not a random act of cruelty. It was a message shaped by years of anger, loss, and unanswered suffering. The rancher knew that once a message is delivered, it cannot be taken back. It changes the receiver forever. By morning, his fear had settled into something heavier: responsibility. He did not know what he was supposed to do, or how to make things right, but he knew he could no longer pretend ignorance. The sign had taken away that choice. When the sun rose, the land looked the same, but the rancher was not. He stepped outside, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of truth press down on him. For the first time in years, he did not saddle his horse to escape the day. Instead, he stood still, listening to the quiet he once trusted. It felt different now, no longer peaceful, but full of expectation. The sign had spoken, and the silence around him waited to see whether he would finally answer. The memories did not come gently. They arrived like a sudden storm, pulling the rancher back into years he had tried to forget. After seeing the sign, his mind opened doors that had been locked for a long time, and behind each door waited scenes filled with fear, anger, and broken promises. He remembered when he was younger, when the land was louder with gunfire, shouting, and hatred. Back then, the frontier was not just empty land. It was a place where power decided truth and silence kept men alive. He remembered standing among other settlers, listening to angry words spoken about the Apache people as if they were not human, as if their pain did not matter. At the time, he felt uncomfortable, but he told himself that discomfort was not his responsibility. He convinced himself that keeping quiet was the same as staying neutral. Now, those memories returned with sharp clarity, and he realized how wrong that belief had been. Neutral silence had helped cruelty grow. He remembered promises made by men in power, promises of peace and fairness that were broken as soon as they became inconvenient. He remembered seeing families forced to move, their faces filled with fear and confusion, while others watched and said nothing. He remembered how he looked away, how he focused on his work, how he chose not to see. At the time, he told himself he was only protecting his future, his land, his life. Now, the weight of those choices pressed heavily on him. Each memory felt like a stone added to a growing burden on his chest. The rancher walked through his house slowly, touching old furniture, worn tools, and faded photographs, realizing that his quiet life had been built on forgotten suffering. He had believed time would soften the past, that years of isolation would somehow balance the wrongs he witnessed. But the past had teeth, and it had finally bitten back. The face of the young girl haunted his thoughts, not because he knew her, but because she represented everyone who had been ignored. She was not just one life lost, she was a reminder of many lives dismissed as unimportant. The rancher sat down heavily, covering his face with his hands, feeling shame settle deep inside him. He understood now that guilt was not loud, it was patient. It waited quietly, growing stronger the longer it was ignored. The land outside his window seemed endless, but it no longer felt forgiving. He realized that history was not something left behind, it lived on through consequences. The broken promises he remembered had not vanished, they had shaped anger, pain, and resentment that carried forward into the present. The rancher thought about how easy it had been for him to walk away back then, how easy it had been to say, "It's not my problem." That sentence echoed painfully in his mind. He understood now that problems ignored do not disappear, they change form. They wait for the right moment to return. The sign, the girl, and the land itself were proof of that truth. He stood up slowly, his legs heavy, his heart tired. For the first time, he admitted to himself that living alone was not an act of strength. It was an act of fear. He had hidden from responsibility, believing survival was enough. But survival without truth had hollowed him out. The rancher felt tears rise not from weakness, but from recognition. He recognized the man he had been, and the harm his silence had allowed. Outside, the wind moved softly across the land, as if whispering stories older than he was. He realized then that broken promises do not belong to the past alone, They demand answers in the present. The memories had returned for a reason, and they would not let him rest until he faced them. Standing there, surrounded by reminders of who he used to be, the rancher understood one painful truth: the past was no longer asking to be remembered. It was demanding to be answered. The girl became a presence in the rancher's thoughts, even when he tried to focus on simple tasks. He did not know her name, her voice, or her story, yet she followed him through the day like a quiet shadow. As he worked, he wondered who she had been before the land turned cruel, before the world failed to protect her. He imagined her walking under the same wide sky, feeling fear where there should have been safety, feeling alone where there should have been care. The thought cut deep, because he understood loneliness too well. But his loneliness had been chosen, while hers had been forced upon her. The rancher realized that the hardest part was not what had happened, but how many chances there had been to stop it. He thought about the adults who should have protected her, the systems that should have cared, and the voices that should have spoken. One by one, they had all failed. And in that long chain of failure, his own silence had played a part. He had not caused her pain directly, but he had lived comfortably in a world that allowed such pain to exist. That truth settled heavily in his chest. He remembered how easy it had been to believe that distance meant innocence, that living far away from others excused him from responsibility. Now he understood that injustice does not need many hands to succeed, it only needs enough people to look away. The girl's youth made everything feel heavier. She had not lived long enough to see change, long enough to hope for something better. Her life had been shaped by decisions made long before she was born, decisions fueled by fear and hatred. The rancher felt anger rise, not wild anger, but a steady, painful kind that demanded honesty. He felt anger toward the people who acted, toward the people who watched, and toward himself for being one of them. He thought about how history often remembers landowners, leaders, and fighters, but forgets the young, the powerless, and the silenced. The girl was not forgotten anymore, not to him. He carried her memory with each step, each breath. As the sun moved across the sky, he found himself stopping often, staring at nothing, lost in thought. He wondered what kind of future she might have dreamed of, what laughter might have sounded like, what fears might have kept her awake at night. These questions had no answers, and that was what hurt most. The rancher realized that protecting the vulnerable is not only about action, it is about courage before harm happens. He had lacked that courage in the past. He had chosen safety over justice, comfort over truth. Now, the cost of that choice stood clear before him. He felt shame, but he also felt a growing need to do something, even if it was too late to fix what was broken. The girl's memory became a mirror, forcing him to see the man he had been and the man he still could be. He understood that honoring her did not mean forgetting the pain, it meant refusing to allow silence to continue. The land outside his home seemed to listen, as if waiting for him to decide. He knew that nothing he did could bring her back, but he also knew that ignoring her story would be another act of harm. The rancher took a deep breath and accepted a difficult truth: responsibility does not end where guilt begins. It starts there. The girl had been unprotected, unheard, and unseen by too many. He would not be one of them anymore. As evening approached, the sky softened in color, and the rancher felt a quiet resolve form within him. He did not yet know what action would look like, but he knew his silence had ended. The girl deserved at least that much. When the rancher finally rode toward the town, the road felt longer than it ever had before. Dust rose with each slow step of his horse, and every familiar landmark now seemed to watch him with quiet judgment. This town was not new to him. He had passed through it many times over the years, buying supplies, exchanging brief words, and leaving before anyone could ask too much. But this time was different. He was not there for tools or food. He was there because silence no longer protected him. As he entered the town, he noticed how little had changed. The same buildings stood in the same places, worn by time but still standing strong. Yet beneath that familiar surface, something heavy lingered. People moved about their business, but their eyes avoided his. Some nodded politely, others looked away quickly, as if they sensed the weight he carried. The rancher felt it clearly now. This was a town built on fear and shared forgetting. Inside the general store, voices lowered when he walked in. Conversation stopped, and then restarted in whispers. He asked simple questions, careful not to accuse, but the answers came back empty. People claimed they knew nothing, had seen nothing, remembered nothing. Their words were smooth, practiced, and tired. The rancher realized this was not the first time truth had been buried here. It was a habit, passed down like an unwritten rule. Don't ask. Don't tell. Don't remember. He felt anger rise again, but it was mixed with sadness. These people were not monsters. They were afraid. Afraid of the past, afraid of consequences, afraid of breaking the fragile peace built on lies. As he walked through the town, he noticed how tightly everyone held on to routine. Routine made forgetting easier. Routine made guilt quieter. The rancher stopped near the edge of town, looking at the land beyond, and understood that this place survived by pretending nothing had ever gone wrong. He thought about how many stories had been erased to keep this calm surface intact. The town had grown by closing its eyes, and now it did not know how to open them again. A man he recognized from years ago met his gaze for a brief moment. In that look, the rancher saw recognition, fear, and a silent request to let things stay buried. That look hurt more than open denial. It told him that people knew the truth, but chose comfort over justice. He felt alone again, but this time it was different. Before, loneliness had been his hiding place. Now, it was the price of refusing to lie. He realized that coming to town was not about finding answers. It was about seeing how deep the silence went. And it went everywhere. The rancher understood that if justice ever came, it would not come from this place easily. The town had protected itself for too long. As he turned his horse back toward the open land, he felt a strange clarity. The town might remain silent, but he did not have to. He could not force others to speak, but he could choose not to be part of the forgetting anymore. Riding away, he felt the weight of rejection, but also the strength of decision. The town faded behind him, small and quiet against the wide horizon. It had chosen fear. He would choose something else. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, the rancher understood that truth does not need permission to exist. It only needs someone willing to carry it forward. The rancher spent that night walking beneath the open sky, turning over the same question again and again until it felt carved into his bones. He had seen what silence could do, and he knew now that returning to it would not bring peace. Yet speaking carried its own cost. He imagined the looks from the town, the closed doors, the old threats whispered as warnings. He imagined losing what little safety he had left. Fear pressed close, familiar and tempting, urging him to step back into the quiet life he knew so well. But another feeling rose beside it, steady and demanding. It was the feeling that comes when a man understands that avoiding pain is not the same as doing what is right. As dawn approached, the rancher stood still and listened to the land wake up. Birds called softly, the wind shifted, and the horizon brightened. He realized that courage did not arrive as a loud promise. It arrived as a simple choice made when no one was watching. He thought about the years he had lived carefully, choosing smallness over truth, safety over justice. Those choices had kept him alive, but they had also kept him empty. Now, the path before him split clearly into two. One road led back to routine, to quiet days and nights without confrontation, to a life that would continue but never grow. The other road led toward uncertainty, toward conflict and judgment, toward a future shaped by honesty rather than fear. The rancher understood that redemption was not about being forgiven by others. It was about refusing to lie to himself any longer. He returned to his house and gathered what he needed, moving with calm purpose. Each simple action felt heavy with meaning. He was not preparing for a fight. He was preparing to be seen. He knew that once he spoke, he could not take his words back. They would change how others saw him, and how he saw himself. Still, he felt a quiet strength settle in his chest. This strength did not erase his guilt, but it gave it direction. He remembered the girl, the sign, the land that remembered everything, and he understood that choosing silence again would be a second betrayal. When the sun rose fully, he mounted his horse, not to escape, but to face what waited ahead. As he rode, fear tried to return, but it no longer ruled him. He accepted that courage does not mean feeling brave, it means acting despite the fear. The rancher knew that he might stand alone, that the town might turn away, that consequences would follow. But he also knew that truth, once spoken, has a way of moving through cracks, even in places built on denial. He was ready to carry that truth, even if it made his life harder. By the time he reached the edge of the town again, his decision was complete. He would speak, not to accuse, but to acknowledge. Not to punish, but to refuse forgetting. As he dismounted, the weight he carried shifted from his chest to his voice, where it belonged. The choice had been made, and there was no turning back. For the first time in many years, the rancher felt whole, not because his past was healed, but because he was finally willing to face it.